For decades it stood as the most potent symbol of a world torn in two, the Berlin Wall. A brutal scar across the heart of a city, separating families, friends, and ideologies. On one side, the vibrant, chaotic pulse of the West, on the other, the stark, controlled rhythm of the East. Its concrete and barbed wire represented more than just a physical barrier. It was the embodiment of the Cold War, a chilling testament to humanity's capacity for division. Through the long, tense years, the wall endured, a seemingly unmovable fixture of the geopolitical landscape. But by 1989, a tremor of change was running through the Soviet bloc. In Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, the old order was crumbling, giving way to popular demand for freedom. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, however, remained a fortress of hardline communist rule, its leadership clinging fiercely to power. The people, however, could no longer be contained. Inspired by the winds of change sweeping through Eastern Europe, and frustrated by decades of repression and economic stagnation, they began to rise. Thousands gathered in Leipzig, then Dresden, then finally Berlin, chanting for reform, for freedom, for the right to travel. The Monday demonstrations grew in size and intensity, the sound of their unified voices echoing through the controlled streets, a direct challenge to the authority of the state. The world watched, holding its breath. Would the wall finally fall? Would Germany, and indeed Europe, finally be reunited? The anticipation was palpable, a global yearning for an end to the ideological chasm that had defined a generation. But in this timeline, the script of history was violently torn, and the promised dawn of unity would never arrive. Instead, a different future, colder and more fractured, began to unfold. The autumn of 1989 crackled with an energy that promised monumental change. In Leipzig, the weekly demonstrations swelled from mere hundreds to tens of thousands, a tide of humanity demanding an end to the suffocating grip of the Socialist Unity Party. The chants of "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people," became the defiant anthem of a nation yearning for liberation, reverberating through the ancient streets and unsettling the foundations of the East German regime. Erich Honecker, the long-serving leader of the GDR, and his inner circle of hardliners watched with growing alarm. Unlike their counterparts in Hungary or Poland, they harbored no illusions of reform. For them, any concession was a capitulation, a betrayal of the socialist ideal. They saw the protests not as legitimate dissent, but as a Western-backed conspiracy designed to dismantle their state. The Stasi, East Germany's notorious secret police, reported directly to them, painting a picture of escalating chaos that demanded decisive action. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev watched too, albeit with a different perspective. His policy of glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, had ignited the very flames of dissent now threatening to engulf East Germany. He had, famously, warned other Soviet bloc leaders that they were on their own, that Moscow would not intervene militarily to prop up faltering regimes. This doctrine, known as the Sinatra Doctrine, had emboldened reformers and protesters alike. However, within the Kremlin, powerful conservative factions viewed Gorbachev's reforms as a dangerous slide towards anarchy. They saw the erosion of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe as a catastrophic failure, a betrayal of hard-won communist gains. As reports of the escalating unrest in the GDR reached Moscow, these hardliners began to exert immense pressure on Gorbachev, arguing for a return to traditional Soviet strong-arm tactics to preserve the socialist Commonwealth. The idea of losing East Germany, a crucial geopolitical buffer and ideological prize, was anathema to them. On November 4, 1989, an unprecedented 1 million people gathered in Berlin's Alexanderplatz, openly challenging the regime. The sheer scale of the protests stunned the authorities, but it only solidified the hardliners' resolve. They viewed this mass demonstration as the final straw, a direct affront to state power. Covert preparations for a widespread crackdown, codenamed Operation Chinese Solution in grim reference to Tiananmen Square, were already well underway, involving elements of the National Volksarmee, NVA, the Stasi, and special police units. A crucial moment arrived when intelligence reports, both from the Stasi and conservative elements within the KGB, reached the Soviet hardliners, painting a dire picture of imminent collapse in East Germany. They presented a false narrative to Gorbachev, exaggerating the threat of Western intervention and framing the GDR protests as counter-revolutionary forces aided by NATO. They convinced him that East German stability was paramount for Soviet security, and that a firm hand was needed to prevent total ideological contagion. Weakened by internal political struggles and unwilling to alienate powerful factions, Gorbachev, against his instincts, gave a reluctant, tacit approval for the GDR to manage its internal security matters as it saw fit, effectively lifting his non-intervention pledge for East Germany. On the night of November 9th, as the world anticipated a historic announcement about travel reforms, the East German regime instead unleashed its forces. Instead of opening the borders, the NVA Stasi and riot police moved in concert across major cities. In Berlin, forces converged on checkpoints and protest hotspots. In Leipzig, protesters were met with overwhelming force. The crackdown was brutal and swift, a coordinated effort to crush dissent and reassert control through terror. Across East Germany, thousands were arrested, many summarily beaten, and some, in the ensuing chaos, even killed. The images that eventually leaked to the West were horrifying: blood-stained streets, desperate citizens being dragged into vans, the cold and passive faces of soldiers and police. The global outcry was immediate and fierce, but the physical barriers remained, reinforced by an iron fist. The wall, far from falling, had become an even more formidable symbol of division, now stained with the blood of its own people. This brutal suppression sent shockwaves through the Soviet bloc. It halted the momentum of reform and signaled a chilling return to hardline tactics. Gorbachev, whose authority was severely undermined by this turn of events, found himself increasingly isolated. His internal adversaries, now emboldened by the success in East Germany, swiftly moved to consolidate their power, effectively sidelining the architect of Glasnost and Perestroika. The dream of a unified Europe, of a world free from the specter of the Cold War, was shattered on that cold November night. The wall stood, and with it, the geopolitical fault lines of the 20th century hardened once more. The brutal suppression of the 1989 protests in East Germany sent a freezing wave across Eastern Europe, extinguishing the flickering hopes of reform. The immediate consequence was the swift and undeniable decline of Mikhail Gorbachev's influence within the Soviet Union. The hardline factions, ascendant after the East German crackdown, blamed him for the initial destabilization and championed a return to rigid ideological control. His policies of Glasnost and Perestroika were gradually but systematically dismantled, replaced by renewed emphasis on party discipline and state authority. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union, though not collapsing, became increasingly insular and suspicious of Western overtures. The internal power struggle culminated in Gorbachev's forced resignation, replaced by a collective leadership dominated by conservatives from the military and the KGB. This new regime, while outwardly maintaining a facade of stability, adopted a more confrontational stance with the West, perceiving NATO expansion as a direct threat to their revitalized sphere of influence. The Iron Curtain, which had shown signs of fraying, was now deliberately reinforced, thicker and more unyielding than before. For East Germany, the crackdown meant an even tighter embrace of Soviet orthodoxy. The Socialist Unity Party, purged of any dissenting elements, tightened its grip on every aspect of life. Surveillance intensified, dissent was brutally quashed, and the Stasi's reach became omnipresent. The promise of economic reform, which had briefly flickered, was replaced by a renewed commitment to central planning, leading to persistent stagnation and a widening technological gap with the West. The Berlin Wall, already a symbol of division, became a permanent fixture, heavily fortified and constantly patrolled, its watchtowers casting long shadows over a city permanently cleaved. In West Germany, the failure of reunification ignited a profound sense of anguish and betrayal. Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who had championed the cause of a united Germany, faced immense public pressure and diplomatic challenges. The division of Germany now seemed permanent, a wound that would never heal. The psychological impact on families and individuals separated by the wall was immense, breeding a deep resentment and a feeling of being abandoned by history. The vibrant economic boom of the West continued, but it was overshadowed by the constant, painful reminder of their brethren just kilometers away, living under an oppressive regime. NATO's role shifted dramatically. Instead of adapting to a post-Cold War era, the alliance reaffirmed its primary mission, containment. Its focus remained squarely on the Eastern Bloc, particularly the revitalized Soviet Union and its hardened satellite states. Military spending, which might have decreased, remained high, fueled by the renewed threat. Western Europe, unable to fully integrate its eastern counterparts, developed a defensive posture, reinforcing its borders and strengthening its internal cohesion. The European Union continued its expansion, but always with the stark understanding that its eastern frontier was a concrete and ideological barrier. Berlin, the former capital, transformed into a permanent Cold War flashpoint, mirroring the Korean demilitarized zone. Checkpoint Charlie, instead of becoming a museum, remained a heavily guarded crossing, a daily testament to the world's enduring division. The city developed a dual identity, a bustling, modern metropolis in the west, and a gray, surveilled, economically struggling outpost in the east. Life on both sides of the wall became a carefully managed existence, defined by the proximity of the enemy and the constant threat of escalation. The dream of a peace dividend vanished. Resources that could have been invested in global development or environmental protection were instead diverted to maintaining vast military machines and elaborate intelligence networks. The proxy conflicts of the Cold War, instead of fading, simmered and occasionally flared, fueled by a Soviet Union keen to reassert its influence, and a NATO determined to prevent further ideological expansion. The world remained locked in a familiar, yet chilling, standoff, postponing the promise of true global cooperation indefinitely. As the 1990s progressed, a generation grew up knowing only this divided reality. For them, the Iron Curtain was not a fading historical relic, but a tangible, ever-present border. The optimism that briefly blossomed in 1989 withered, replaced by a grim acceptance. The Cold War had simply paused, recalibrated, and settled in for a much longer, more insidious fight, casting its long shadow over the dawn of a new millennium. The arrival of the digital age in the 1990s, in this divided world, did not bring about unification but rather a new, sophisticated form of segregation. The Internet, initially envisioned as a global network connecting humanity, instead evolved into two distinct and largely incompatible systems, mirroring the geopolitical split. In the West, the nascent World Wide Web flourished, driven by open protocols, decentralized development, and a strong emphasis on free information flow. Innovation was rapid, often chaotic, and fundamentally global in its aspirations. East of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union and its allies, acutely aware of the Internet's potential for both economic progress and ideological subversion, pursued a different path. They developed their own controlled, centralized digital infrastructure. RUNET, as the Soviet bloc network became known, was designed from the ground up for state control and surveillance. Access was restricted, content was heavily filtered, and every user interaction was meticulously logged. The goal was to harness the power of information technology for economic planning and military advancements, while simultaneously preventing the influx of Western ideas and maintaining social cohesion. This digital Iron Curtain profoundly impacted scientific and technological development. Western companies and researchers focused on collaboration and open-source initiatives, leading to rapid advancements in areas like personal computing, e-commerce, and global communication. Silicon Valley boomed, creating vast new industries. Meanwhile, the Eastern Bloc, despite significant state investment, struggled with proprietary systems, limited external collaboration, and a pervasive culture of suspicion that stifled true innovation. Their focus was often on industrial automation, military applications, and internal data management, rather than consumer-facing technologies or global connectivity. The impact on ordinary citizens was stark. In the West, the Internet became a tool for empowerment, information, and unprecedented social connection, albeit with its own emerging challenges of privacy and misinformation. People could communicate instantly across continents, access vast libraries of knowledge, and participate in global cultural exchange. Life became increasingly interconnected, despite the geopolitical divisions. In the East, access to internet was a privilege, not a right. It was primarily used for official communications, state-approved education, and propaganda dissemination. Citizens often accessed the internet through heavily monitored public terminals and personal computers, though slowly becoming more available, were expensive and closely regulated. Dissidents attempted to bridge the digital divide using dial-up modems and encrypted communications, but the risk of detection and severe punishment was ever present, making true digital freedom a dangerous fantasy. The division extended to cybersecurity. Western nations developed sophisticated defense mechanisms against state-sponsored hacking from the East, leading to an ongoing digital arms race. The Soviet bloc, in turn, invested heavily in offensive cyber capabilities, seeing them as a powerful, deniable tool for espionage and destabilization against their Western adversaries. Critical infrastructure, government networks, and even private corporations became battlegrounds in this new, silent war, constantly under threat from sophisticated cyber attacks. Culturally, the digital divide created separate information ecosystems. Western popular culture, music, and ideas spread globally through the open internet, shaping a shared cultural landscape. In the East, state-controlled media and curated digital content fostered a distinct, often isolated, cultural narrative, filtering out anything deemed ideologically unsound. This led to a stark divergence in public perception, historical understanding, and even artistic expression, further entrenching the ideological split. Even the mobile phone revolution played out differently. While the West rapidly adopted smartphones and global cellular networks, the Eastern Bloc prioritized secure, encrypted communication for state actors and developed separate, less interconnected mobile infrastructures for its citizens. This ensured that even personal communication could be monitored, and mass gatherings organized through mobile tech remained difficult to orchestrate covertly. The digital age, far from dissolving the physical barriers, had simply erected invisible ones, creating two distinct global realities. The attacks of September 11, 2001, ripped through the Western world, just as they did in our own timeline. Yet, in a world still cleaved by the Cold War, the global response was profoundly different, fragmented by pre-existing ideological divides. While the West recoiled in horror and immediately mobilized against extremist networks, the Eastern Bloc's reaction was measured, often cynical, and primarily self-serving. The shared global threat of terrorism, rather than uniting humanity, merely highlighted its persistent fractures. President George W. Bush's declaration of a war on terror was met with immediate solidarity from NATO allies. The alliance, already hardened by a decade of renewed Cold War tensions, quickly adapted its strategies to combat this new, amorphous enemy. Intelligence sharing intensified, military cooperation expanded beyond traditional battlegrounds, and Western nations presented a largely unified front against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. The global fight against terrorism became another arena where Western values of freedom and democracy were contrasted against extremist ideologies. The Soviet Union, under its hardline leadership, initially offered a lukewarm condemnation of the 9/11 attacks, viewing them primarily as a Western problem. They were more concerned with controlling their own internal dissenting movements and maintaining stability within their sphere of influence. While they possessed vast intelligence networks and military capabilities, their cooperation with the West on counterterrorism was minimal, often transactional, used as leverage for other geopolitical gains. They were reluctant to share sensitive intelligence or commit resources to a fight that didn't directly serve their immediate strategic interests. The subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, launched by the United States and its allies, deepened the global rift. The Eastern Bloc, particularly Russia and China, vehemently opposed these interventions, decrying them as examples of Western unilateralism and neo-imperialism. Their state-controlled media narratives spun the conflicts as further evidence of Western aggression, rather than a legitimate response to terrorism. This narrative resonated within their borders, reinforcing anti-Western sentiment and providing internal justification for their own authoritarian regimes. The War on Terror also presented the Soviet bloc with opportunities. They subtly supported anti-Western insurgencies, providing arms and intelligence through proxies, undermining Western efforts without direct confrontation. Furthermore, the global focus on Islamic extremism allowed Eastern Bloc regimes to intensify their own crackdowns on internal ethnic and religious minority groups, framing them as potential terrorists, and quashing any nascent separatist movements with renewed impunity, largely shielded from Western criticism preoccupied with other conflicts. The digital Iron Curtain played a critical role in shaping the information landscape of the War on Terror. Western citizens consumed news and analysis from diverse, if sometimes partisan, sources, fostering debate and dissent. In the East, state media presented a monolithic, carefully curated narrative, demonizing Western interventions and portraying their own regimes as bulwarks against both Western aggression and external extremism. This propaganda effectively insulated Eastern populations from alternative viewpoints, cementing their distrust of the West. Even the nature of terrorism evolved within this divided context. While Al-Qaeda and ISIS-like groups emerged as global threats to the West, other forms of extremism, often ethno-nationalist or separatist, found tacit support or strategic exploitation within the Eastern Bloc, becoming proxy forces in the ongoing Cold War. The fight against terrorism became less about a universal evil and more about which ideological side defined the threat, blurring the lines between liberation movements and state-sponsored terror. Ultimately, the War on Terror did not bridge the Cold War divide, it reinforced it. It provided new justifications for entrenched positions, fueled propaganda narratives on both sides, and diverted global attention from the fundamental ideological conflict that still defined the world. The Berlin Wall, far from being irrelevant, remained a potent symbol of this deeper, more pervasive division, a constant reminder that even shared global threats could not unite a fractured planet. As the 2010s dawned, the Cold War, far from being a historical relic, had matured into a deeply entrenched global reality. The world was not simply divided, it was a complex tapestry of alliances, rivalries, and spheres of influence, all orbiting around the two enduring poles of power, the Western democracies led by the United States and NATO, and the Eastern Bloc, consolidated under a resurgent, more confident Soviet Union and its allies, including a powerful and increasingly assertive China. The Berlin Wall, now over half a century old, stood as a monument to this persistent ideological schism. The geopolitical landscape was a mosaic of proxy conflicts and simmering tensions. In Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, competing interests fueled regional instability. The Soviet Union, having rebuilt its military and economic strength, actively supported anti-Western movements, providing arms, training, and strategic intelligence. NATO, in turn, worked to bolster democratic governments and counter Soviet influence, often through covert operations and economic incentives. These proxy wars were rarely direct confrontations but rather shadow boxing matches, fought by surrogates and designed to test the limits of each superpower's reach. The arms race continued unabated, albeit with a focus on advanced technology and cyber warfare. Both blocs invested heavily in stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, and sophisticated missile defense systems. The space race, too, saw renewed vigor, with competing efforts to establish military dominance in orbit and develop anti-satellite weaponry. This constant military modernization drained immense resources from both sides, diverting funds that could have addressed pressing global challenges like climate change or poverty, keeping the global economy in a state of perpetually guarded readiness. Propaganda reached new levels of sophistication in the digital age. The Western Internet, while ostensibly free, became a battleground for influence, with both state and non-state actors attempting to shape public opinion. Social media platforms, initially seen as tools for connection, were weaponized, spreading disinformation and deepening societal divisions. In the East, the Runet served as an even more controlled environment, carefully curated by state censors to project an image of strength, stability, and moral superiority, while demonizing the perceived decadence and instability of the West. The economic systems continued to diverge. Western economies, driven by market forces and globalization, face persistent challenges from recessions, inequality, and the complexities of intertwined global markets. The Eastern Bloc, while achieving some economic growth through state-directed industrial policy and resource exploitation, struggled with innovation, consumer goods shortages, and pervasive corruption. The disparity in living standards between East and West Germany, visible across the Berlin Wall, remained a stark and painful reminder of these diverging economic paths. Human vignettes along the Berlin Wall continued to paint a poignant picture of division. Families remained separated, communicating through tightly controlled channels or risky clandestine meetings in neutral third countries. Generations had grown up on either side, instilled with different histories, different values, and a deep-seated distrust of the other. For many, the hope of reunification had long faded, replaced by a quiet resignation to a permanent separation, a profound sorrow that seeped into the very fabric of their lives. Diplomacy in this decade was a delicate dance, always shadowed by the threat of escalation. Summits between Western and Eastern leaders were rare, heavily choreographed affairs, designed more for projecting an image of stability than achieving genuine breakthroughs. Trust was scarce, and every international agreement was viewed through a lens of suspicion and strategic advantage. The world was caught in a perpetual strategic deadlock, where gestures of peace were often perceived as weakness, and aggression as a necessary show of strength. This continued division meant that global cooperation on existential threats like climate change, pandemics, or nuclear proliferation remained severely hampered. Each bloc pursued its own solutions, often at odds with the other, prioritizing national security and ideological advantage over shared human survival. The prospect of a truly unified global response to these challenges seemed an impossible dream, perpetually sacrificed on the altar of the enduring Cold War. Today, in the mid-2020s, the Berlin Wall stands as an immutable, almost ancient monument to a world that never reconciled. It is not merely a concrete barrier, but a living scar, intricately woven into the fabric of daily life, culture, and geopolitics. Generations have been born, grown, and aged with its presence, accepting its reality as a fundamental truth of their existence. The children of 1989 are now grandparents, and the promises of a unified Europe exist only in forgotten history books on one side, and as a dangerous fantasy on the other. Modern Berlin is a city of two distinct souls. West Berlin thrives as a vibrant, interconnected global hub, its architecture gleaming, its streets bustling with international visitors and innovative businesses. Yet, its western frontier remains the wall, a constant, nagging reminder of what could have been. East Berlin, conversely, retains its austere, state-controlled character. Its infrastructure is functional but dated, its economy tightly managed, and its social fabric carefully monitored. The stark contrast is visible even from space, a literal line drawn across the urban landscape, separating two vastly different futures. The Cold War has evolved into a state of perpetual, low-intensity conflict, occasionally flaring into proxy wars in contested regions. Cyber warfare is constant and sophisticated, a relentless battle waged in the digital shadows, targeting critical infrastructure, financial markets, and information networks on both sides. Disinformation campaigns are pervasive, tailored to exploit social divisions in the West and reinforce state narratives in the East. The global information space remains deeply fractured, with separate digital ecosystems and filter bubbles making genuine understanding between the blocs almost impossible. Economically, the two blocs operate largely independently. Western economies remain driven by global capitalism, innovation, and interconnected trade routes, though they frequently contend with protectionist policies and market manipulation from the East. The Eastern Bloc, led by a highly centralized Soviet economic system and its Chinese partner, relies on state-directed planning, strategic resource control, and a focus on domestic self-sufficiency. Trade between the two worlds is heavily regulated, often politically motivated, and restricted to strategically important goods, maintaining a fragile balance of power. Nay, the human cost of this enduring division is immeasurable. Families remain separated across the wall, their lives governed by bureaucratic restrictions and a constant longing for connection. Love stories are shattered, careers are stifled, and individual freedoms are curtailed by the ideological chasm. For many on the eastern side, the memory of 1989 serves as a chilling reminder of the consequences of dissent, fostering a pervasive culture of compliance and quiet desperation. Yet, even in the East, a subterranean current of dissent and longing for freedom persists, fueled by illicit access to Western media and whispered stories of a different life. NATO and its allies remain vigilant, their military forces highly trained and technologically advanced, always poised for potential escalation. Regular military exercises along the fortified borders serve as potent demonstrations of resolve. On the other side, the Warsaw Pact, though reorganized and renamed, maintains a formidable military presence, its doctrines steeped in defensive readiness and aggressive counter-response. The military standoff is a constant, expensive burden, defining global priorities and diverting resources from social and environmental progress. Diplomacy is a high-stakes chess match, played by seasoned adversaries who understand the nuances of ideological conflict. Bilateral talks are often deadlocked, and multilateral institutions like the United Nations struggle to bridge the chasm, becoming arenas for ideological posturing rather than genuine consensus. The world remains divided, a planet caught in a perpetual Cold War, its people living under the constant shadow of geopolitical tension, forever shaped by a single, pivotal moment in 1989 when the world chose division over unity. The Berlin Wall, still standing, still guarded, remains the starkest testament to a future that could have been, and to the profound cost of an alternate history. It is a monument to what happens when hope is crushed, when hardliners refuse to yield, and when a superpower chooses renewed confrontation over genuine reform. The tremor of freedom that ran through Eastern Europe in 1989, a tremor that in another timeline brought down walls, here met an unyielding, brutal force, forever altering the course of human events. The price of this division is immeasurable. It is counted in the families forever separated, in the aspirations of millions stifled by an authoritarian state, and in the persistent shadow of fear that permeates daily life on one side of the wall. It is measured in the vast resources poured into an unending arms race, diverted from addressing the shared human challenges of disease, poverty, and environmental collapse. It is etched into the very psyche of a world that, for decades, has known only suspicion and ideological conflict. This enduring Cold War has shaped not just geopolitics, but the very essence of human interaction. The digital age, a tool for connection in another world, became a weapon of control and a facilitator of propaganda in this one. Scientific progress is bifurcated, cultural exchange stifled, and genuine global cooperation on existential threats remains an elusive dream. Two distinct realities, two different versions of humanity's future, continue to unfold side by side, forever separated by ideology and concrete. The lessons of this divided world are stark. They speak to the fragility of peace, the enduring power of ideology, and the human capacity for both resilience and profound regret. They remind us that history is not predetermined, but rather a series of choices, each with monumental consequences. The world we see today, split and scarred, is a living, breathing testament to the pivotal moment in 1989 when a different path was chosen, leading humanity away from unity and into an enduring age of separation.